Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The case of Lillian Harrow isn't one that appears in most historical records of Shannon County, Missouri. For decades, it remained buried in fragmented documents, scattered across courthouse basements, newspaper archives, and the occasional mention in private correspondence. What happened in that isolated homestead in the autumn of 1894 was, as one local newspaper delicately put it, a case almost too gruesome to mention. The Ozark Mountains have always kept their secrets well, valleys so deep that sunlight touches the bottom for only a few hours each day. Forests so dense that sounds travel strangely, sometimes amplified, sometimes swallowed completely. The region's isolation has bred both independence and suspicion among its inhabitants, qualities that would play a significant role in what happened to Lillian Harrow. Our story begins not with Lillian herself, but with a journal discovery made in 1963, when the old Harrow homestead was finally scheduled for demolition. The property had remained abandoned for nearly 70 years, perched on a rocky outcropping overlooking the Current River, about 8 miles northeast of the town of Eminence. Local residents had long avoided the place. Bad air, some would say. Others simply wouldn't talk about it at all. Frederick Chambers, a historian documenting vernacular architecture of the Ozarks, was granted permission to examine the homestead before its destruction. In the crawl space beneath the kitchen floorboards, sealed in a metal box, he found a leather-bound journal. The name inscribed on the first page, "Property of Lillian Harrow, 1894. The journal would eventually be archived at the Missouri Historical Society, where it remained largely forgotten until 1968. When parts of it were briefly referenced in a doctoral dissertation on frontier women's lives. The dissertation was never published, and the researcher, Margaret Collins, reportedly abandoned her academic career shortly afterward. What follows is drawn from this journal, supplemented by newspaper accounts, court records, and testimonies from residents of Shannon County. Some details remain unverifiable. Some contradictions were never resolved. But this much seems clear. Something happened in that house on the bluff that altered the fabric of an entire community. The Harrow homestead sat at the end of a winding dirt path that branched off from what is now Route 19. In 1894, it would have been at least an hour's ride by horse from the nearest neighbor. The two-story structure was unusual for the region. Most homes were single-story cabins built of rough-hewn logs. The Harrow place, by contrast, was constructed of sawn lumber with a steep gabled roof and narrow windows. It suggested means beyond those of the typical Ozark settler. According to county records, the property was purchased in 1891 by Thomas Harrow, who arrived from St. Louis with his wife Lillian. Thomas was listed as a man of business in the deed of sale, though precisely what business he conducted remains unclear. The couple had no known family connections in the area, which was unusual for the time. People didn't simply move to Shannon County without reason. The isolation and rugged terrain made it an unlikely destination for those without ties to the region. Local memory preserved through oral histories collected by the Shannon County Historical Society in 1952 suggests the Harrows paid for the property in cash, an unusual transaction that raised eyebrows among the locals. The previous owner, Jeremiah Sullivan, reportedly seemed eager to sell despite having built the house only 5 years earlier. When questioned about his reasons for leaving, Sullivan would only say that the place didn't sit right with him. He left the county shortly after the sale and was never heard from again. A curious footnote appears in the records of a San Francisco boarding house dated 1896. A man matching Sullivan's description registered under the name John Smith and reportedly told the proprietor he was running from something back east. He stayed only 3 nights before disappearing, leaving behind a sealed letter addressed to the current resident of the Bluff House, Eminence, Missouri. The letter was never delivered and remained unopened until 1967, when it was found among the boarding house's archived records. Its contents, finally revealed, consisted of a single sentence, "Check beneath the hearthstones." Lillian's journal begins in April of 1894, nearly 3 years after their arrival. The early entries describe a woman attempting to adapt to rural isolation after city life. She writes of planting a kitchen garden, of failed attempts at bread making, of learning to preserve vegetables for winter. But between these domestic notations runs a current of unease, particularly regarding her husband's frequent absences. T has gone again to what he calls his southern office, she writes in one entry. He speaks of clients and papers requiring his attention, yet returns with mud on his boots and scratches on his hands. I have ceased to inquire. The journal suggests that Thomas would disappear for days at a time, offering vague explanations about business in nearby towns. Yet Lillian notes that he always returned with the wagon empty, carrying nothing that would indicate commerce or trade. These absences increased in frequency during their second year at the homestead. By the spring of 1894, he was often gone for a week or more at a stretch. An entry from May 1894 provides a particularly unsettling detail. T returned after midnight. I pretended sleep, but watched through half-closed eyes as he carried something wrapped in canvas from the wagon to the cellar. The shape suggested a human form, though smaller than an adult. He did not emerge for nearly 2 hours. When he came to bed, his hands smelled of chemicals despite thorough washing. Local memory, gathered from descendants of Shannon County families, suggests that Thomas Harrow was viewed with a mixture of respect and wariness. He paid for goods in cash, rather than through the typical system of exchange and credit. He attended no church, and most notably he employed no local help at the homestead, unusual for a man of apparent means. There was, however, one exception to this rule, briefly mentioned in Lillian's journal. In the summer of 1893, Thomas hired a local man named Ezekiel Porter to help dig what he described as a root cellar beneath the existing cellar floor. Porter worked for approximately 2 weeks before abruptly departing. According to Lillian, Thomas explained that Porter had received word of a family emergency requiring his immediate return to Kentucky. No one in Shannon County ever saw Porter again. County records show no trace of an Ezekiel Porter having lived in the area, though a man of that name was reported missing from a lumber camp in West Virginia in 1892. The connection, if any, remained speculative. Lillian, by contrast to her husband, was rarely seen. In 3 years, she visited Eminence perhaps a half-dozen times, always in her husband's company. She was described in one account as fair-haired and soft-spoken, with the manner of someone perpetually startled. The storekeeper's wife noted that Lillian wore gloves regardless of the weather, even in the heat of summer. When asked about this, she simply said that her hands required protection. An interview conducted in 1952 with Martha Whitman, then 82, reveals an additional detail about one of these visits. Martha, the daughter of storekeeper Elias Whitman, recalled that, as a girl of 24, she had helped Lillian select fabric for a new dress. Her sleeve rode up as she examined the cloth, Martha recalled, and I glimpsed what looked like severe bruising around her wrist. When she noticed my gaze, she quickly pulled the sleeve down and said, "My husband's research requires precision. I sometimes assist him." A particularly telling incident occurred in the summer of 1893, a year before the events that would later unfold. According to church records, the local minister, Reverend Silas Thompson, made a courtesy call to the Harrow homestead, as was his custom with all residents of the parish. He was met at the door by Thomas, who politely but firmly declined the visit. From inside the house, the Reverend reported hearing what he described as a sound of distress, quickly silenced. When he inquired if all was well, Thomas explained that his wife suffered from nervous complaints and could not receive visitors. The Reverend was never invited to return. In his private diary, discovered after his death in 1912, Reverend Thompson wrote more candidly about the encounter. "I fear for the woman in that house. Her cry was not that of physical pain, but of something deeper, despair perhaps." Harrow's explanation seemed rehearsed, his manner too controlled. "I offered to speak with Mrs. Harrow through the door to offer what comfort I might, but was refused in terms that bordered on threatening. I left with a heavy heart, wondering what occurs in that isolated place." Thompson apparently brought his concerns to the county sheriff, Jacob Mercer, who dismissed them as overreaction. "The Harrows are private folk," Mercer reportedly said, "and a man has the right to manage his household as he sees fit." This response was typical of the era and region, where domestic matters were considered strictly private affairs. By June of 1894, the journal entries begin to shift in tone. Lillian writes of sounds in the walls at night, which she initially attributes to mice. She describes Thomas's increasing irritability and his insistence on keeping the cellar door locked at all times, and she mentions, with growing frequency, a peculiar odor that seems to permeate the house despite her cleaning efforts. "It is strongest near the hearth," she writes, "a smell like damp earth and something metallic, tea. Claims not to notice it and becomes angry when I persist." The journal entry for June 17th records an unsettling discovery. While Thomas was away, Lillian noticed a dark stain spreading across the kitchen ceiling. Believing it to be a leak in the roof, she examined the attic but found no evidence of water damage. The stain, she writes, seemed to be seeping upward through the plaster from below. When Thomas returned and saw what had happened, he became enraged, forbidding her from mentioning it again. That night, while Lillian pretended to sleep, she observed him removing boards from the kitchen floor and applying some substance to the underside of the ceiling. The stain did not reappear. In a later entry, Lillian speculates on what might have caused the stain. "I believe something in the cellar is leaking upward. The fluid must be corrosive, as it ate through both the floorboards and the plaster. What manner of chemicals is tea working with, and what requires such caustic substances?" A significant entry appears on June 23rd, when Lillian records discovering an unfamiliar key among her husband's belongings while mending his coat. She describes it as heavy and old-fashioned, unlike any that opens doors in this house. When Thomas discovered the key missing, his reaction was extreme. He systematically searched the house, questioning Lillian repeatedly about its whereabouts. She claimed ignorance, having hidden the key beneath a loose floorboard in their bedroom. Thomas's distress over its loss seemed disproportionate, suggesting it opened something of great importance. On June 30th, Lillian writes of a strange encounter in the woods surrounding their property. While gathering berries, she came upon a small clearing she had never noticed before. In the center stood what she described as a peculiar arrangement of stones forming a rough circle perhaps 6 feet in diameter. The ground within the circle appeared disturbed, as if recently dug and refilled. Most unsettling was her discovery of a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby branch, fabric that matched a shirt Thomas had claimed to have lost weeks earlier. "I cannot explain why," she writes, "but I felt compelled to leave that place immediately. The silence was absolute, no birds, no insects, as if all living things avoided that spot." On July 2, 1894, Thomas Harrow visited the general store in Eminence and purchased an unusual quantity of supplies: 50 pounds of salt, 20 pounds of coffee, multiple bottles of carbolic acid, then commonly used as a disinfectant, and several yards of heavy canvas. The shopkeeper, Elias Whitman, noted the purchase in his ledger with a single question mark. When casually questioned about such large quantities, Thomas explained that they were preparing for visitors from the medical society, an explanation that seemed odd given the isolated location and the Harrows' known reclusiveness. Whitman's ledger contains an additional note, written in the margin, "Asked after Porter. H. claimed no knowledge of any such person." This cryptic reference to the missing laborer suggests that Ezekiel Porter's disappearance had not gone entirely unremarked in the community. 3 days later, Lillian's journal records that Thomas began extensive work in the cellar, the sound of his hammer continuing late into the night. She was forbidden to enter. When she asked what he was building, he told her it was storage appropriate to our needs. Lillian describes attempting to peek through the cellar keyhole, but finding the view obscured by what appeared to be a heavy cloth hanging on the other side of the door. She could hear Thomas talking, though she could discern no words and heard no responses. Either he speaks to himself, she writes, or to something that cannot answer. A curious detail appears in the journal entries from this period. Lillian begins to mention a recurring dream in which she descends the cellar stairs to find not a cellar at all, but a long corridor lined with glass cabinets. In the dream, Thomas stands at the far end, beckoning her forward. As she approaches, she realizes the cabinets contain not objects, but people, perfectly preserved, their eyes following her movement. She always wakes before reaching him. I had the corridor dream again, she writes on July 12th, but this time one of the cabinets was empty, with the door standing open. T stood beside it, gesturing for me to step inside. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. I tried to run, but my limbs would not obey. I could only move forward, one slow step at a time. The entries through July and early August document an increasing strain between the couple. Thomas began locking Lillian in their bedroom at night, claiming it was for her safety in his absence. She writes of hearing him pace the house at odd hours, of muffled conversations when no visitors had called, of tools being moved and replaced. I believe there is someone else in this house, she wrote on August 10th. I hear movement in the cellar when T is clearly visible to me in the yard. When I mentioned this, he examined me as one might inspect a cracked plate, determining if it can still be used or must be discarded. The journal records an attempt to flee on August 12th. Taking advantage of Thomas's momentary distraction, Lillian slipped from the house and made it nearly half a mile down the path before he caught her. She does not detail what followed, saying only, "I will not try again." The consequences are too severe. The next several entries are brief and subdued, suggesting a woman writing under duress or close observation. On August 14th, she describes finding a strange, blue-tinged stain on her nightgown that she could not account for. "It resembles the color of copper sulfate solution," she writes, "yet I have handled no such chemical. The skin beneath the stain tingles in an unpleasant manner." An unusual entry appears on August 15th. In handwriting that seems rushed and smaller than her normal script, Lillian notes, "There is another journal, hidden where he cannot find it. If these words are being read, seek the hollow oak at the bend in the path." No such second journal has ever been discovered, despite searches conducted after the revelation of the first. The hollow oak, if it ever existed, is long gone from the landscape. However, in 1967, a surveyor working in the area reported finding an ancient oak tree with a hollow trunk containing the remains of what might have been paper materials, too deteriorated to recover or decipher. The location roughly matched the description in Lillian's journal. On August 16th, Lillian records waking in the night to find Thomas sitting beside their bed, simply watching her sleep. When she stirred, he did not move or speak, but continued staring with what she described as clinical interest, as if observing the progress of some experiment. She pretended to fall back asleep, but remained awake, watching through barely opened eyes as he eventually rose, drew a small notebook from his pocket, made some notation, and left the room. On August 18th, the journal records that Thomas departed for what he said would be an extended business trip to Springfield. He left Lillian with strict instructions not to leave the property or admit anyone who might call. The journal entries for the following days show her initial relief at his absence, followed by a growing curiosity about what lay behind the cellar door. "The key to the cellar is not on his key ring which he took," she wrote on August 21st. "It must be hidden somewhere in the house." For 3 days, Lillian searched. She methodically describes her exploration of every room, every drawer, every possible hiding place. She found nothing of note until, on August 24th, she discovered a loose floorboard in Thomas's study. Beneath it was a small metal box containing papers and a heavy iron key. My hands trembled so violently I could scarcely lift the box, she writes. Even before opening it, I knew what I would find, the key to the cellar door. But what else might be hidden with it? What secrets does my husband keep beneath the floorboards of our home? The papers, as described in her journal, included correspondence with someone identified only as H.M. The letters referenced shipments, storage requirements, and substantial sums of money. One mentioned the necessity of absolute preservation until transfer can be arranged. Another contained a curious phrase that Lillian copied verbatim. The female specimens prove more resilient to the process, particularly when prepared gradually. Your domestic arrangement may prove ideal for the final experiment. Also in the box was a small notebook filled with what appeared to be chemical formulas and anatomical drawings. Lillian, who had no scientific training, could make little sense of these, but was disturbed by the frequent references to gradual introduction and living tissue response. Several pages contained tables recording dates, doses, and observed effects, though the subject or subjects of these observations were not identified. Most disturbing was a series of photographs, crude but recognizable, showing what appeared to be human limbs in various states of preservation. Some were mummified, others suspended in clear liquid. On the back of one photograph was written, 85 days post-treatment, note retention of color and tissue elasticity. Lillian describes sitting for hours with these materials spread before her, trying to comprehend their meaning, to find some innocent explanation for her husband's activities. There must be some proper scientific purpose to this work, she writes. T is educated, civilized. Yet why the secrecy? Why the hidden room? Why does my heart race with dread when I consider what may lie behind that cellar door? On August 25th, Lillian used the key to open the cellar door. What she found there was, in her words, beyond all rational expectation or comprehension. The journal entry for this day spans several pages, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. Much is illegible or so fragmented as to defy interpretation, but certain phrases stand out with disturbing clarity. The shelves he built, all around the walls, glass containers, impossible to believe, preservation of some kind, the faces still recognizable, numbered and labeled, some dating back year. Who are these people? Oh God, what has he been doing? One passage suggests that Lillian recognized someone among the specimens. Mrs. Keller from Winona, reported moved to California last year, her eyes open as if still seeing, the liquid cloudy around her face. Label reads, partially successful. What does this mean? The entry continues with fragmented observations. The workbench, surgical instrument, jars of chemicals labeled in T's hand, detailed drawings of anatomical specimens, a journal recording subjects and procedures. The floor sloped to a central drain, hosing coiled on hooks, a cabinet of glass syringes, larger vats in the back corner covered with canvas. Lillian's description grows increasingly incoherent as the entry continues. Behind the last shelf, another door, smaller room, the smell overwhelming, something moving in one of the tanks. Not possible. Preservation but not death. Eyes following my movement, fingers pressing against the glass. The date on the label, 3 months ago. How can this be? The entry ends abruptly. There is no entry for August 26th. When the journal resumes on August 27th, the handwriting has changed subtly. The words are more precisely formed, the pressure on the page more controlled. I have made a grave error in judgment. There is nothing unusual in the cellar. Thomas's work requires specimens for study. He is a man of science. I have misunderstood. When he returns, I will explain my foolishness and beg forgiveness. This strange, measured tone continues for several entries. Lillian writes of cleaning the house thoroughly, of preparing Thomas's favorite meals in anticipation of his return, of catching up on mending that had been neglected. There is no further mention of the cellar or its contents. However, certain phrases appear occasionally that seem at odds with the placid domestic narrative. My fingers feel numb today. The blue marks on my arms have spread. Difficult to stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. The mirror shows someone I scarcely recognize. A local hunting guide later reported to the county sheriff that he had observed smoke from the Harrow chimney during this period, despite the unusually warm weather. Passing on the river below the property, he claimed to have heard a woman's voice, singing the same verse over and over, like a child might. When asked what song, he could not recall the words, but hummed a few bars of what was recognized as "Beautiful Dreamer," a popular parlor song of the era. The guide also mentioned seeing a pale face at an upstairs window watching him as he passed. "Not right, that face," he reportedly said. "Too still. Like one of them photographs where they prop up the dead to look living." On September 3, 1894, Thomas Harrow returned to eminence. According to Elias Whitman's account, he purchased additional supplies, including more salt, alcohol, and several large glass jars. He also spent considerable time at the post office, sending and receiving multiple letters. Before departing for his homestead, he inquired about hiring a wagon and driver for the following week, explaining that he needed to transport delicate goods to the railway station in West Plains, some 40 miles away. Whitman's ledger notes an additional purchase that day: a bottle of laudanum, a common opiate tincture used for pain relief. Thomas explained it was for his wife's female complaints. The quantity purchased was, in Whitman's estimation, enough to ease the suffering of 10 women. Thomas also bought a quantity of ice from the local ice house, an unusual purchase given the distance to his property and the lack of proper refrigeration. When asked about this, he explained that he needed it for the preservation of perishable materials. Lillian's journal entry for September 3rd notes Thomas's return with seeming equanimity. Tea arrived this evening, pleased with the state of the house. He brought sugar candies from Springfield. All is well. However, a detail in this entry suggests something amiss. In the midst of describing Thomas's return and the ordinary activities of the evening, Lillian writes, "The hands move differently now. Not my hands, not my will directing them. I watch them write these words as if from a distance." The entries for the next few days describe domestic tranquility. Thomas worked in his study. Lillian preserved late summer vegetables. The weather turned cooler. On September 7th, she writes that Thomas announced they would be having a guest the following day, a business associate from St. Louis. She was instructed to prepare the spare bedroom and a special dinner. The entry for September 8th is brief. "The gentleman has arrived. His name is Dr. Howard Merrick. He speaks very little but watches intently. I do not care for his gaze." According to Lillian's description, Merrick was tall and thin, with hands too large for his frame. He carried a black medical bag which he never allowed out of his sight. During dinner, she noted that he examined her with the detached interest one might show a horse at auction. When she served coffee, he insisted on adding the sugar himself, producing a small vial from his waistcoat pocket. Thomas, she observed, nodded slightly at this gesture. The remainder of this entry contains an odd passage, written in a cramped, hurried hand at the bottom of the page, as if added later, "Must stay alert." What was in the vial? Something bitter in the coffee. Room tilting strangely. Merrick asking Thomas about the progress of cellular transformation, mentioning previous failures, discussing me as if I were not present, or perhaps no longer human, must stay. There is no entry for September 9th. The journal resumes on September 10th with a cryptic line: "They have been in the cellar all day. The sounds are difficult to bear." Later in this entry, Lillian describes feeling increasingly unwell, dizzy spells, numbness in her extremities, periods of confusion. She attributes these symptoms to anxiety over the visitor's presence. She also notes that Thomas has been preparing all her meals, insisting that she rest while he tends to household duties, an unprecedented reversal of their usual roles. "I found myself standing before the mirror this morning," she writes, "uncertain of how long I had been there. My reflection seemed different, as if looking at someone who resembled me but was not quite me. T came in and led me back to bed, murmuring that soon I would be perfected. She continues, "There is a vial beside the bed now filled with blue-tinged liquid. T applies it to my wrists and throat each night, saying it will help me sleep. The smell is familiar, the same odor that permeates the house. After application, my skin feels cool, then numb. The sensation spreads inward until I feel disconnected from my own flesh." The next entry, dated September 11th, contains a disturbing observation. Dr. Merrick left this morning. His bag seemed heavier than when he arrived. T has been unusually attentive since, almost gentle. I pretend not to notice how he studies my face, my hands, the shape of my throat. In the days that follow, Lillian's entries become more disjointed. She describes increasingly vivid dreams in which she is floating in cool, blue-tinged darkness. She notes Thomas measuring her limbs with string while she pretends to sleep. She mentions a persistent metallic taste in her mouth and the sensation that her skin has become too tight, like a glove poorly fitted. On September 13th, she reports finding a notebook in Thomas's coat pocket while he was bathing. It contained what appeared to be daily observations of her condition, subject showing initial signs of cellular preservation, slight blue tinge to extremities, decreased respiration rate, pupillary response slowed but present. Estimate 30-35% total blood volume replaced with solution. Continue current dosage. On September 15th, Lillian writes of waking to find Thomas standing beside their bed, simply watching her sleep. When she stirred, he placed a hand on her forehead as if checking for fever. "Rest," he told her. "You'll need your strength." From here, the journal entries become increasingly alarmed. Lillian writes of finding her clothes packed away, of Thomas preparing all meals himself, of a bitter taste in the tea he insisted she drink each evening. She notes increasing periods of lost time, hours she cannot account for, conversations she only half remembers. "I found a small puncture on my arm this morning," she writes on September 20th, "like an insect bite, but perfectly circular. There is a similar mark from 3 days ago that has not healed." She continues, "When I press my fingertips together, they remain blanched for an unnaturally long time. My heartbeat feels sluggish, distant. When I cut myself slicing vegetables yesterday, the wound seeped clear fluid, not blood. T seemed pleased when he bandaged it, calling it progress." An entry from September 21st suggests she attempted to reach out for help. "I tried to write a note to Mrs. Whitman at the general store. T caught me before I could hide it in the egg basket for delivery. He did not become angry as I expected. He simply took the note, read it, and said, 'Too late for that, my dear.' The process has already begun." In the same entry, she describes discovering a glass vial hidden under her pillow, containing a clear liquid with a faint blue tinge. When she confronted Thomas about it, he explained it was a preservative measure for her health. When she pressed further, he responded cryptically, "Some things must be preserved before they are lost. I have learned this lesson well." The most coherent entry, dated September 22nd, records a chilling conversation. Lillian writes that she directly asked Thomas about the specimens in the cellar. Instead of denying their existence as she expected, he calmly confirmed her worst fears. He spoke of advancing the science of preservation beyond anything previously achieved, she writes. He said the human form could be maintained indefinitely with the right techniques, the right chemicals. He said his previous subjects had taught him much, but were ultimately flawed experiments. According to the journal, Thomas then took her hand and told her she would be different, the culmination of years of research. He explained that the process had already begun, that the tea, the mysterious punctures, the substance under her pillow, all were preparing her body for perfect preservation. "You will be beautiful forever," he told me, "neither dead nor truly alive, suspended in that perfect moment between my masterpiece." Lillian records her response. I asked him why this obsession with preserving what must naturally decay? He looked at me with genuine surprise, as if the answer were self-evident. "Because I love you," he said, "because I cannot bear the thought of losing you to time and death. Because what is beautiful should remain so eternally," he continues. He spoke of his mother's death when he was a child, how he watched her deteriorate from consumption, growing more skeletal by the day, how he had sworn then to find a way to arrest decay, to hold back the ravages of time. His first experiments were on small animals, preserving them while still living. Later came human subjects, the homeless, the displaced, those who would not be missed. He spoke of these things without emotion, as if describing a series of academic exercises. The entry concludes with a chilling realization. He truly believes he is doing this out of love, that this living death he plans for me is a gift, and I cannot escape. The process is too far advanced. I can feel the changes in my body, the slowing of my functions, the cooling of my flesh. I fear that soon my mind will follow, leaving only a perfectly preserved shell with my face. The final dated entry in the journal is September 23, 1894. It consists of a single line. "He is preparing the cellar for me. What happened in the days that followed must be pieced together from other sources." On September 28th, Thomas Harrow arrived alone at the general store in Eminence. He purchased supplies for a single person and informed Elias Whitman that his wife had returned to St. Louis due to ill health. He also confirmed his need for a wagon to transport goods to West Plains, arranging for it to arrive at his property on October 2nd. Whitman later recalled that Thomas seemed unusually animated during this visit, speaking rapidly about his plans to return to St. Louis himself once his business was concluded. He mentioned something about a position at a medical college that would make his reputation secure. When asked directly about Lillian's condition, he became evasive, saying only that she required specialized care, unavailable in Shannon County. A curious footnote to this interaction appears in Whitman's personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1910. He notes that Thomas paid for his purchases with coins that were damp to the touch, as if recently washed. More disturbing was his observation that Thomas's fingernails had a bluish tinge that could not be attributed to cold, given the mild autumn weather. Whitman also recorded that Thomas purchased additional preserving jars and chemicals, explaining that he intended to put up the last of the season's produce before departing. This seemed odd, as Thomas had never before shown interest in such domestic activities. Perhaps most telling is Whitman's final observation. "Harrow displayed to me a gold band which he claimed was his wife's wedding ring, saying she had left it behind in her haste to depart. He asked if I knew anyone who might be interested in purchasing it, as he had no further use for such sentimental items. I declined, finding something unseemly in the transaction." On the morning of October 2nd, James Pruitt, a local man hired to drive the wagon, arrived at the Harrow homestead. According to his later statement to the county sheriff, he was instructed to wait while Thomas loaded several large wooden crates onto the wagon. The crates were sealed and bound with metal strapping. Thomas explained they contained scientific specimens bound for a medical college in St. Louis. Pruitt noted that Thomas seemed agitated and insisted on departing immediately, despite the lateness of the hour and the difficult terrain that would need to be navigated in darkness. They set out for West Plains, but made slow progress due to the weight of the cargo and the poor condition of the roads. In his statement, Pruitt mentioned a detail that was not included in the official report: a persistent odor emanating from the crates, which Thomas attributed to the preservative chemicals used on the specimens. Pruitt described it as sweet but sickening, like meat gone slightly off. He also claimed that at one point he heard what sounded like liquid sloshing inside the crates when the wagon hit a particularly deep rut in the road. Most disturbing was Pruitt's account of a conversation during their journey. Thomas allegedly spoke at length about his research, becoming increasingly animated. He claimed to have made a breakthrough that would revolutionize the understanding of human preservation. When Pruitt inquired about the nature of this breakthrough, Thomas reportedly replied, "The secret is to begin the process before death occurs, to gradually replace the blood with preservative solution while the subject still lives. The results are remarkable." According to Pruitt, Thomas then began to describe his wife in strange terms, referring to her as his greatest achievement, and speaking of her in the present tense, despite having claimed she had returned to St. Louis. When Pruitt expressed confusion, Thomas quickly changed the subject. They stopped for the night at a roadside inn near what is now the town of Winona. According to the innkeeper's later testimony, Thomas insisted that the wagon be locked in a shed overnight and refused to let the crates out of his sight. He and Pruitt shared a room, with the crates stacked against one wall. The innkeeper, Samuel Brooks, recalled that Thomas asked unusual questions about the property, specifically whether there was a cool, dark storage area where his specimens might be kept more securely. Brooks offered the root cellar, but Thomas declined after inspecting it, saying it was inadequately ventilated. During dinner, Thomas reportedly consumed several glasses of whiskey, unusual behavior, according to Pruitt, who had never seen him drink alcohol previously. As the evening progressed, he became increasingly talkative, making cryptic references to preservation of living tissue and cellular suspension. At one point, he allegedly told Brooks that he had discovered a way to keep beauty eternal and offered to demonstrate his technique when they reached St. Louis. What happened that night remains a matter of dispute. Pruitt claimed he awoke to find Thomas standing over him with a knife. In the struggle that followed, one of the crates was damaged. The innkeeper, alerted by the commotion, entered the room with a shotgun. What he saw inside the broken crate caused him to fire both barrels into Thomas Harrow's chest, killing him instantly. The official report filed with the Shannon County Sheriff states only that the crate contained human remains prepared in a manner consistent with medical preservation. No charges were filed against the innkeeper, whose action was deemed self-defense due to the threatening posture of the deceased. However, an unofficial account of the incident, preserved in a letter from the innkeeper to his brother, provides more disturbing details. According to this letter, the damaged crate contained a glass tank filled with a bluish liquid. Floating within was what appeared to be a human head, the features still recognizable as female. What caused the innkeeper to fire, he claimed, was not Thomas's threatening posture, but the fact that the eyes of the preserved head suddenly opened and seemed to focus on him. "I cannot express the horror of that moment," Brooks wrote. The head was clearly that of a woman, fair-haired and delicate-featured. The preservation was remarkable, not the gray, sunken appearance of death, but lifelike in color and texture. It was the eyes that undid me. They opened slowly, as if waking from sleep, and fixed upon me with unmistakable awareness. The mouth moved slightly, as if attempting to speak. I fired without conscious thought, driven by pure terror. In a detail omitted from his official statement, Brooks claimed that as Thomas fell, he whispered, "She's still aware. My perfect preservation." The remaining crates were taken to the county courthouse in Eminence. According to courthouse records, they were examined by a doctor from West Plains, who documented the contents before they were buried in unmarked graves in the county cemetery. The doctor's report was sealed by judicial order. It remains in the courthouse archives to this day, accessible only by special permission from the county commissioner. In 1932, during the construction of a new wing of the courthouse, workers discovered a small metal box embedded in the foundation of the original structure. Inside was a single page, apparently torn from the doctor's original report. The page contained a partial inventory of the crate contents, listing 8 preservation vessels of varying sizes and anatomical specimens representing partial or complete preservation of at least 5 individuals. Most disturbing was the notation that specimen F7 exhibits unusual signs of cellular activity despite apparent death. Recommend immediate burial with quicklime. The county commissioner at the time, William Danforth, reportedly ordered the page burned and sworn statements of silence from all workers present. In his private correspondence, discovered after his death in 1954, he justified this decision. Some knowledge serves no purpose but to disturb the minds of decent people. What Harrow did goes beyond criminal to something that offends natural law itself. Let it remain buried physically and from memory. As for Lillian Harrow, no trace of her was ever officially found. She is not listed among the specimens in the brief summary of the sealed report. No record exists of her return to St. Louis or appearance elsewhere. The last confirmed evidence of her existence is her journal, abruptly ended on September 23rd. However, local legend in Shannon County tells a different story. In the decades following the incident, residents near the abandoned Harrow property reported occasional glimpses of a woman with fair hair standing at the upstairs window or walking along the bluff overlooking the current river. The sightings occurred exclusively in autumn, often around the last week of September. More disturbing were the reports of sounds emanating from the empty house on still nights. The rhythmic creak of a rocking chair, soft humming, or what some described as wet footsteps moving from room to room. These accounts were dismissed by authorities as superstition, the kind of ghost stories that accumulate around any site of tragedy. A hunter named Samuel Davis claimed to have actually encountered the figure while tracking deer near the property in 1927. In an account recorded by a local folklorist, Davis described seeing a woman in a white dress standing beside the current river. Thinking she was lost, he approached to offer assistance. As he drew near, he noticed that her skin had an unnatural bluish cast and that her movements were stiff, mechanical. Most unsettling, he claimed, was that when she turned to face him, her eyes appeared to be filmed over, like those of a dead fish. Davis fled the scene and refused to hunt in that area again. In 1939, a group of local teenagers, drawn by rumors about the abandoned house, ventured onto the property on a dare. Only 3 returned. Their account of what happened to the 4th member of their party, 16-year-old Michael Collins, was so inconsistent and improbable that authorities concluded the boy had simply fallen into the river and drowned. His body was never recovered. The surviving teenagers told varying stories. One claimed they had seen a woman in white leading Michael away into the forest. Another insisted they had all fled after finding jars containing human remains in what was left of the cellar. The third refused to speak about the incident at all and was committed to the state hospital in Farmington 6 months later, suffering from what doctors diagnosed as acute melancholia with paranoid features. In his few lucid moments, this boy reportedly told an attendant that she had tried to preserve Michael, that they had found him half submerged in a tank of blue liquid in the remains of the cellar, still conscious but unable to move or speak. They had tried to rescue him, but she had returned. The boy would say no more about who she was or what had happened next. When Frederick Chambers discovered Lillian's journal in 1963, he also reported finding something else in the sealed metal box, a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a preservation fluid, and within it a single human finger. This detail was omitted from his official report to the Missouri Historical Society, but was mentioned in private correspondence found among his effects after his death in 1967. In a letter to a colleague at the University of Missouri, Chambers wrote, "The finger appears female, judging by size and the remains of a gold band embedded in the flesh. The preservation is remarkable. The skin retains its texture, the nail its luster. Most disconcerting is the color, a faint blue tinge that seems to emanate from within the tissue itself, rather than from the surrounding fluid. I am reluctant to send it for analysis, as doing so would necessitate explaining its provenance." The letter continues with a disturbing observation. "I have kept the vial on my desk for 3 days now. Last night I observed what I can only describe as movement, a slight flexing of the joint, as if the finger were attempting to bend. I understand how irrational this sounds, yet I am certain of what I saw. More disturbing still, the ring appears to have shifted position slightly, rotating around the digit as if deliberately turned. The finger, if it existed, has never been located. Chambers' notes suggest he reburied it somewhere on the Harrow property before the homestead's demolition, considering it the only fitting conclusion to a story of such profound disturbance. A local man who assisted with the demolition later claimed that Chambers had indeed buried something at the site, a small metal box placed in the foundation of what had been the cellar. The man recalled Chambers performing what appeared to be a brief religious ceremony after the burial, though Chambers was not known to be particularly devout. The doctoral candidate who later studied the journal, Margaret Collins, reportedly visited the former Harrow property in the autumn of 1968. She spent several days camping near the site, conducting what she described in notes as contextual research. Upon her return to the University of Missouri, she withdrew from her program and refused to discuss her experience with colleagues. Her dissertation remains unfinished in the university archives. A curious footnote to Collins's aborted research appears in the university medical records. 2 weeks after her return from Shannon County, she sought treatment for what she described as persistent numbness and discoloration of her right hand. The examining physician noted unusual bluish mottling of the skin, which he attributed to poor circulation. Collins did not return for follow-up treatment. Her current whereabouts are unknown. However, in 1975, a woman matching Collins's description was briefly admitted to a psychiatric facility in Kansas City, giving her name as Lillian. According to hospital records, she claimed to be partially preserved and in need of the blue solution to maintain her condition. She was diagnosed with delusional disorder and treated with antipsychotic medications. She left against medical advice after 3 days and was never readmitted. The attending physician noted that her skin had an unusual waxy texture and that her body temperature was significantly below normal. Today, the site where the Harrow homestead once stood is unmarked, indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. The current river continues its timeless flow below the bluff. Occasional hikers pass through the area, unaware of what occurred there. The story of Lillian Harrow has faded from local memory, preserved only in scattered documents and the whispered recollections of Shannon County's oldest residents. Some stories in the Ozarks are told openly, shared as cautionary tales or local color for visitors. Others are handled more carefully, passed down with reluctance, and only when necessary. The case of Lillian Harrow belongs to this second category, a narrative too disturbing to relate in full, yet too significant to allow complete erasure. In 1957, during road construction along what is now Route 19, workers uncovered a small cache of glass jars buried approximately 2 miles from the former Harrow property. The jars contained preserved organic material which, according to the county medical examiner's brief report, appeared to be human tissue in various stages of experimentation. The find was quickly reburied, the location unmarked on any official maps. The workers were advised not to discuss what they had seen. One of those workers, however, later described the discovery to his grandson, who recorded the conversation in 1982 as part of an oral history project. According to this account, the jars contained human hands in various states of preservation. Some appeared mummified, others were suspended in clear liquid. Most disturbing, the worker claimed, was that several of the better preserved specimens still wore wedding rings. There must have been 20 or 30 jars, the worker recalled, all sizes, from small enough to hold a finger to large enough for a whole hand. The preservation was perfect, like they'd been removed yesterday, not decades ago. And there was one that, here the recording becomes indistinct, but the worker seems to describe a specimen that moved when the jar was lifted into the light. The connection between these jars and Thomas Harrow's activities remains speculative. No formal investigation was pursued, perhaps due to the passage of time, or perhaps, as one former county official suggested off the record, because some doors are best left closed. In the spring of 1965, a biology teacher at the Eminence High School received an anonymous package containing a single glass slide, prepared for microscopic examination. The slide was labeled only with the initials LH and the date 9/23/1894. When placed under the microscope, it revealed human tissue with highly unusual cellular characteristics, structures that appeared to be neither fully alive nor completely dead. The teacher forwarded the slide to the University of Missouri for analysis, but it was reportedly lost in transit. The source of the package was never identified. The biology teacher, Robert Matthews, later reported a strange encounter that occurred shortly after he received the slide. A woman he did not recognize approached him outside the school, asking if he had seen what Thomas achieved. When he asked for clarification, she reportedly said, "Perfect preservation of consciousness within cellular suspension. I am his finest work." Before Matthews could respond, the woman walked away. He described her as pale, with fair hair and unusually deliberate movements. When he tried to follow her, she had vanished. What do we know with certainty about Lillian Harrow? She came to Shannon County as a bride. She lived in isolation. She kept a journal that ended abruptly. And after September 23, 1894, no verified record of her exists. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The journal itself raises questions that have never been adequately addressed. The sudden change in handwriting after the cellar discovery. The shift in tone from terror to placid acceptance. The meticulous documentation of symptoms consistent with what we now recognize as the effects of certain preservative chemicals on living tissue. In her final coherent entry, dated September 21st, Lillian wrote, "I understand now what I saw in the cellar, not specimens for study, but practice, refinement of technique. Tea speaks of perfecting the process while he watches me drink the tea. He says I am to be his masterwork." This entry continues with a passage that was partially obscured by water damage, but was reconstructed by Frederick Chambers. The others were failures because they were dead before preservation. The secret, he says, is to begin the process while the subject still lives, to replace the blood gradually with his solution, to accustom the tissues to their new condition. He says I will be conscious throughout, that I will see, hear, perhaps even feel, but will be perfectly preserved forever. A chilling postscript appears at the very bottom of this page, written in what appears to be different handwriting, perhaps added later, perhaps by someone else. He succeeded. I remain, not living, not dead. Aware, trapped, God help me, I remain. Thomas Harrow's background, too, contains significant gaps. No record exists of medical training, yet the techniques used on his specimens suggested considerable anatomical knowledge. The mysterious correspondence with H.M., presumably Dr. Howard Merrick, indicates a network of individuals with similar interests, yet no further information about this network has ever come to light. A possible clue emerged in 1937 when a fire at a medical college in Philadelphia revealed a hidden room containing preserved anatomical specimens of uncertain provenance. Among the items recovered was a logbook with entries dating from 1889 to 1893, recording experiments in suspension of cellular degradation. One entry mentioned a T.H. who had advanced the process beyond all expectations and was continuing his work in isolation suitable to its nature. The college administration quickly suppressed this discovery, and the specimens were reportedly destroyed. However, rumors persisted among medical students that one specimen, a female torso preserved in an unusual blue solution, had been secretly acquired by a private collector. This collector, never identified, was said to have claimed that the specimen occasionally exhibited signs of awareness, including pupillary response to light and slight movements of the preserved musculature. What was the purpose of Thomas Harrow's grim collection? The preservation of human specimens was not unknown in 19th century medical practice, but the scale and secrecy of his operation suggested motives beyond conventional study. Some researchers have suggested connections to the nascent field of cellular research, others to the darker corners of anthropological collection that characterized the era. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that Lillian was not his first wife. Among the papers found beneath the floorboard was a photograph showing Thomas with a different woman, identified on the back only as E.H., 1888. No record of this woman has been located in any available archives. However, a newspaper account from Hartford, Connecticut, dated 1889, reports the mysterious disappearance of a Elizabeth Harrow, wife of a medical researcher who subsequently left the area. The article notes that authorities found nothing suspicious, despite concerns raised by Elizabeth's sister about her increasingly infrequent and oddly worded letters in the months before her disappearance. The final letter reportedly contained the unsettling phrase, "Thomas has found a way to make me ageless." Further research revealed a pattern of similar disappearances connected to Thomas Harrow's movements across the country. In Boston, 1884, a laboratory assistant named Sarah Willoughby vanished after working closely with a Dr. Harrow on experiments involving tissue preservation. In Chicago, 1886, a widow who rented rooms to Thomas reported that he left suddenly, taking with him her sister, who had been visiting from Iowa. In each case, authorities found insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The current river continues to flow past the bluff where the Harrow homestead stood. The forests of the Ozarks have reclaimed the site, erasing all visible evidence of what occurred there. But beneath the surface, questions remain. In 1965, 2 years after finding Lillian's journal, Frederick Chambers returned to Shannon County. According to hotel records in Eminence, he stayed for 3 nights in late September, the same period when local legend claimed sightings of Lillian occurred. What he sought or whether he found it remains unknown. His academic papers contain no mention of this trip. However, a curious entry appears in the visitor log of the Shannon County Courthouse during this period. Chambers apparently requested access to the sealed report on the contents of Thomas Harrow's crates. Permission was denied, but the clerk on duty later recalled that Chambers seemed unusually insistent, claiming he had evidence of ongoing activity related to the case. Even more telling is a statement from the caretaker of the county cemetery, who reported that Chambers spent several hours walking among the unmarked graves where the contents of Harrow's crates had reportedly been buried. According to the caretaker, Chambers carried surveying equipment and made careful measurements and notes. When asked about his purpose, he allegedly replied that he was mapping the boundaries between life and death. The demolition crew that finally razed the Harrow homestead in 1963 reported unusual difficulties with the structure. Tools malfunctioned. Workers experienced sudden illness. The cellar in particular presented problems. The concrete floor proved remarkably resistant to breaking, as if specially formulated. When it finally yielded, there was nothing beneath but hard-packed earth. If anything had been buried there, it had been removed long before. Or perhaps not. Local rumor suggests that during particularly heavy rains, the current river sometimes reveals things along its banks that should have remained hidden: glass containers, metal implements, occasionally bones. These items are typically reburied by whoever finds them without report to authorities. Some secrets, it seems, the people of Shannon County prefer to manage in their own way. In 1970, a fisherman on the current river reported finding a glass jar half embedded in the mud of the riverbank, approximately a quarter-mile downstream from the former Harrow property. The jar contained what he described as a human ear, perfectly preserved in clear liquid. He reburied it where he found it, marking the spot with a cairn of river stones that has since been scattered by floods. More recently, in 1989, heavy flooding exposed part of the riverbank near the former homestead site. A group of canoeists reported seeing what appeared to be the corner of a metal container protruding from the mud. Park rangers investigated, but found nothing by the time they arrived. The canoeists, however, maintained their story, adding the disturbing detail that they had heard a woman's voice calling faintly for help as they passed the exposed container. The story of Lillian Harrow represents more than just a historical curiosity or local legend. It speaks to the vulnerability of isolation, to the danger that can hide behind respectable facades, and to the way communities process trauma, sometimes through acknowledgement, sometimes through deliberate forgetting. It also raises unsettling questions about the nature of preservation, not just of physical remains, but of stories themselves. What does it mean that Lillian's narrative survives primarily through her journal, a document that itself shows signs of tampering or alteration? Is the Lillian who began the journal the same as the one who made the final entries? Or did Thomas, in some sense, begin his preservation of her by appropriating her words? In 1967, a graduate student in chemistry at the University of Missouri analyzed the composition of the residue found in the glass vial discovered with Lillian's journal. His findings, never formally published, but preserved in his research notes, identified compounds consistent with early embalming fluids, but with unusual additives including derivatives of curare, a paralytic agent, and certain organic dyes that would impart a bluish tinge to preserved tissue. Most intriguingly, he noted the presence of compounds that would theoretically slow cellular degradation while maintaining membrane integrity. In essence, a formula that might preserve tissue in a state between life and death. The student, Alan Prescott, became fascinated with the chemical properties of the residue, attempting to recreate the formula based on his analysis. University officials terminated this line of research when they discovered its nature and source. Prescott left the university shortly afterward and established a small private laboratory in rural Kansas. In 1980, local authorities investigated the laboratory following complaints about unusual odors and strange lights at night. They found the building abandoned, but containing equipment consistent with advanced chemical research. In a locked room at the back, they discovered what was described in police reports as a tank containing blue-tinged liquid and organic material of unknown origin. The material was destroyed, and the case was closed without further investigation. In the end, what happened at that homestead on the bluff remains partially obscured, like so much of the history of this rugged, beautiful region. The Ozarks keep their secrets, revealing them only in fragments, only to those who know how to look and how to listen. The last verified reference to the case appears in county maintenance records from 1969. A marker was placed at the former Harrow property, not to commemorate the events that occurred there, but to designate the land as permanently unsuitable for development. The marker has since disappeared, but the land remains undisturbed, avoided by locals who may not know exactly why they feel uncomfortable there, but heed the feeling nonetheless. In 1975, a hiker reported finding an unusual tree near the site of the former homestead, an oak with a hollow trunk that contained what appeared to be glass fragments and the deteriorated remains of a small book or journal. By the time authorities investigated, a forest fire had swept through the area, destroying whatever evidence might have remained. Some speculate this may have been the second journal Lillian mentioned hiding in a hollow oak, though this cannot be verified. A curious postscript to this incident appears in the records of the Missouri Department of Conservation. The forest fire that destroyed the hollow oak was unusual in several respects. It began without apparent cause, burned in a perfect circle centered on the tree, and extinguished itself after consuming only that immediate area. Fire investigators found no evidence of arson or natural causes such as lightning. One investigator noted in his report that the ashes where the tree had stood had an unusual bluish tinge, and that the ground remained unusually cold to the touch for several days afterward. And so the story ends, or perhaps continues in ways we cannot fully document. The Journal of Lillian Harrow remains in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, available to researchers who specifically request it, though few do. The sealed report on the contents of Thomas Harrow's crates gathers dust in the Shannon County Courthouse. The site of the homestead blends indistinguishably into the surrounding wilderness. But on certain autumn evenings, when the mist rises from the current river and silence settles over the bluffs, local residents still occasionally report hearing something from the direction of the old Harrow place. Not quite a voice, not quite a cry. Just a sound that seems to carry within it a warning, or perhaps a lament, for something that cannot be undone. Park rangers in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, established in 1964 to protect the current river, have documented several unusual incidents near the former Harrow property. In 1982, a canoeist reported seeing a woman in white standing on the bluff, her image perfectly reflected in the river below, despite the moving water. In 1994, exactly 100 years after the events described in Lillian's journal, 3 separate hiking parties reported encounters with what they described as a female figure with bluish skin along the trails near the site. In each case, the figure was said to have raised one hand as if in warning before disappearing into the forest. Most recently, in 2005, a park ranger on routine patrol reported finding a series of glass vials arranged in a perfect circle on the ground where the Harrow homestead once stood. The vials contained a blue-tinged liquid and were labeled with dates ranging from 1894 to 1964. By the time the ranger returned with colleagues to document the find, the vials had vanished. His superiors attributed the incident to fatigue or misidentification, but the ranger maintained his account, adding that he had experienced an overwhelming sense of being watched while at the site. For those who study the darker chapters of Ozark history, the case of Lillian Harrow represents a boundary, a line between what can be comfortably examined and what perhaps should remain undisturbed. As one elderly resident of eminence put it when asked about the case in 1970, "Some things you don't go looking for. Some things, if they want to be found, will find you." In 2012, nearly 50 years after the discovery of Lillian's journal, a researcher at the Missouri Historical Society noticed something peculiar about the document during a routine preservation assessment. Using modern imaging techniques, they detected text on what had previously appeared to be blank pages at the back of the journal. Text that had been written in a clear liquid, possibly milk or lemon juice, which had darkened only slightly with age. Though much was illegible, one phrase stood out clearly: "I am still here." The researcher who made this discovery requested a leave of absence shortly afterward and did not return to her position. The journal was returned to storage with a notation that it should not be subjected to further technical analysis without special permission. That permission has never been granted. A final disturbing coda to the story emerged in 2015 when a construction crew excavating for a new visitor center near Eminence uncovered what appeared to be an old well shaft not marked on any maps. At the bottom of the shaft, approximately 30 feet down, they discovered a metal container similar to a coffin, sealed with heavy bolts. Following protocol for potential archaeological finds, they contacted state authorities. Before officials arrived, however, the container was reportedly stolen from the site overnight. Security camera footage showed only a blurred figure moving with unusual stiff-limbed motions. The theft was never solved, and the contents of the container remain unknown. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of Lillian Harrow's story may be not what we know, but what remains unknown, sealed in archives, buried in unmarked graves, or preserved only in the fading memories of those who understood the true nature of what happened in that house on the bluff overlooking the current river in the autumn of 1894. Perhaps the true horror lies in the possibility that Lillian Harrow never truly died, that somewhere, in some form, the woman who wrote, "He is preparing the cellar for me," continues to exist, suspended in that state Thomas described as neither dead nor truly alive, a cautionary tale about the human desire to preserve what should naturally pass away, and the consequences of tampering with the boundary between life and death. The case of Lillian Harrow, a case almost too gruesome to mention,